Raymond. How are you?
I'm not so bad at all, thank you. Thank you. And yourself, Richard?
Yeah, I'm okay, thank you. I'm hot, a bit hot today. Never seem to know quite what you're getting these days. Not like the old days, right? When we were kids, when summer was just proper summer and it was
Winter was
hot and it
proper
lasted.
winter.
Yeah, never quite know what's happening these days, do you? Weather was better under the old Labour government, I think. So I'm looking forward to the restoration of normal,
The
predictable weather patterns.
the campaign for proper weather, that might be a slightly longer term goal.
So what's grabbed your attention lately?
I spent a considerable amount of kind of spare time in the last week building a shed. I say building, assembling a shed. And what I noticed was, for somebody who is of, frankly, relatively low levels of competence when it comes to manual skills, I really quite enjoyed it. There was really something about the difference between then not being a shed and then there being a shed, which was really satisfying. And given that it was very carefully designed for relatively inept people to put together, the level of what I was being asked to do was just about within my capability. And wow, it felt great. That must be what it feels like to do a proper job.
So not too easy then. You were pushed a little bit.
Tiny bit, yeah. Yeah, I had to make decisions. I had to make choices, mainly around correcting earlier errors that I'd made. But, I was able to do that and able to work the requisite machinery, a drill. So, yeah, that felt like quite an achievement. I will post a photograph of my shed on the podcast website if that's a thing we can do.
I think our audience, he or she, will really look forward to that. Before we move on, I mean, I think there is something quite wonderful about the process of just creating, isn't there? That something that didn't exist now does exist. Whether that's writing, making music, art, or building a shed.
Yeah.
Albeit from a kit form, by the sounds of what you did.
Oh,
There's just something very rewarding about that, isn't it? Bringing something into existence.
yeah. And slightly miraculous. You're back as sort of caveman days of sort of, this isn't just finding a cave that's okay to sit in. You're, as the evolution scientists would say, you're constructing a niche. My wife, as you know, is a very keen knitter. There is something incredible about the fact that you take something as linear as a very long sequence of pieces of wool, and you turn them into something as three-dimensional as a sweater. There's some kind of magic going on there that's even possible.
Well, I'm glad that you built a shed. I'm even more glad that you derived a sense of satisfaction from it, and I look forward to not only seeing the picture. I hope one day maybe I would get a tour. Go to actually see the thing.
Oh, you will, and I will go into extreme detail about how I constructed the base. So there you go, something to look forward to.
I can't wait.
And what is it that you've noticed in the past little time?
I feel like this is going to be a bit ranty, I think, and this might be an age thing. It might. I wonder if people much younger than this wouldn't be quite so exercised by it. So we at the University of Birmingham had a campus protest for several weeks. We had a camp, a pro-Palestinian camp, and I want to be very clear that I'm not at all having any sort of issue with people's right to protest. And indeed, there's a big part of me that feels really pleased that young people are energized enough to want to protest. So it's about something, I think that's a good thing. I think we had the poll tax when I was at university, the community charge, if you remember that. And now, it's good. It's good, right, that people have something to protest about. What I've noticed though, and this feels like just something that's crept in imperceptibly over the last few years, and now seems to be I feel like what a big problem in society is just the incredible polarization of views, and how. So I think one of the things about the protest was it seemed to be quite an intolerant protest of any other view. And so I feel like society has somehow slipped away from the ability to have kind of nuanced conversations that don't take an extreme position. And it feels like discourse more generally is the poorer for that.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. We see that in lots of places, don't we? Nuance is not in season at the moment.
I think I forget the precise terminology, but I read an article about YouTube, and it said that the words that you need to put into the title of your video in order to get clicks, the top three words are something like destroys, annihilates, murders, or something. So you'll get a title like Jordan Peterson destroys woke activist or something like that.
Yeah,
And you succumb to the awful clickbait thing, and you watch it, and it's just Jordan Peterson having a chat with somebody else. No destroying,
yeah.
no
Saying the
annihilation
things that
goes on.
he's probably going to say, and the other person says the things they're probably going to say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
two people talking about things they believe in, and
Mm.
there's no destroying. But it seems like that appeal to the extreme is
Yeah.
something that I'm finding myself increasingly bothered about, and in particular, people's unwillingness to just allow other people to have a different view.
Yeah. I mean, we've, as you say, both the social media and some of the technology of social media, seems a part of that. I mean, what else would you attribute that change to?
Well, I mean, people have always had differences of opinion, haven't they? I think that's fine. People have fought wars over differences of opinion and different claims to different beliefs or different bits of land or whatever it is. So that's not new. It just feels like in general common discourse, there's this real sort of polarity, and yeah, and I find it hard to attribute it to anything other than social media. Um,
Yeah.
but are you aware of the phenomena? We probably need to talk about this because our audience, such as he, she, they are, this might happen to us, right? Have you heard of the concept of audience capture?
No. No, I'm interested.
So this is the notion of people such as us now in the podcast or social media world being radicalized by their own audience. Um,
Ah,
so the idea is, so say you're a little bit to the left politically, let's say.
hmm,
So, you have a brand about promoting left leaning ideas. And then one day you say something that's sort of just a bit more to the left than you ordinarily would say. And you get massively reinforced for saying it. So people are all over this, they'll retweet and they'll kind of disseminate this slightly more extreme version of your view because it's just a bit more in this incredibly sort of busy media space.
hmm,
That's the thing that will sort of
yeah.
chime more loudly above the noise because it's a bit more extreme. And so almost without knowing it, you start to become more extreme.
Oh,
You know what gets the clicks, you know what gets
yeah.
the retweets, etc. And so you just end up being more and more extreme. And then before too long, you're just out in some far left, ultra woke sort of craziness that you a place you didn't inhabit before. And the same would be true on the right. The same would be true for, I guess, religious fundamentalists, for example, that
Yeah.
the more extreme thing you say, the more reinforcement you get, and therefore the more extreme you
Yeah.
get.
Well, and what that instantly reminds me of, and it may well remind you of it as well, Rich, is a kind of like famous. It's not one specific psychology experiment, but it's a famous kind of psychology prank in lecture halls, undergraduate lectures. So the idea that the entire audience to a lecture will agree between themselves beforehand some criterion, right? So if there's a lecturer who wanders around a bit, if they are slightly to the left hand side of the stage, we're going to smile, make eye contact, and nod. If they wander over to the right hand side of the stage, we're going to look down, not make eye contact, frown a little. And that's the only rule. And so the story goes, whenever this is applied, obviously with the lecturer not knowing it, what happens is the lecturer ends up standing against one wall and completely avoiding the other side of the room. And if you ask them why they're doing it, they don't know. So it's not a conscious process. It's just one of those processes of reinforcement that, sort of familiar as a psychological theory, but actually applied, it just seems like a perfect analog of your audience capture.
I did not know that. Did not know about that experiment, but that is fascinating, and I feel like that is a subject that we need to return to in another episode. That the idea of the various influences on us that we are not consciously aware of, which leads into a whole conversation about what degree of free will we really have.
A nice, small, self-contained topic. Excellent.
Indeed. So we've seamlessly slid into our in today's topic, which is psychology. So we are
Mm.
in our introductory batch of episodes unpacking our title, Two Old Psychologists Talking About Stuff. So we're into psychology territory here. About a million and one different ways we could take this conversation. I suppose where I'd want to start is why, of all the things you could have done with your life, all the many talents you have, aside from DIY, we've established,
Mm.
the options you could have had, why did you find yourself in the world of psychology?
I mean, this is something I've kind of discussed with people before, and the danger is the more often you discuss something, the more it becomes like a fixed and rigid story, and the more danger there is of it being oversimplified and elaborated. However, I think what I'm about to say to you is literally true. When I was at secondary school, in the early years of it, I struggled a lot with a lot of the subjects, and the one thing I was really pretty good at was English. And so when the first time we had to talk about, in broad sense, about career kind of ideas in order to select the right O levels, as they were in those days, I'm that old. I said, well, what am I going to do? I want to go to English. I don't want to be a teacher. Nobody can rely on becoming a writer. So, kind of what's left. And the one thing that I sort of latched onto was advertising. I was really interested in adverts and how adverts worked and why some of them were better than others. And so I thought, yeah, okay. So I went to my careers teacher and I said, I think I want to work in advertising. And then I don't think they had anybody say that to before. So they just kind of like stroke their chin a bit and say, oh, yeah. It's all psychology, that, isn't it? So yeah, psychology. You'll want to do psychology if you want to be in advertising. So I kind of like dutifully went along to Bolton Central Library and went to the psychology section. And I found a book called the Hamlin All Colour Paperback of Psychology. And I thought, well, I better start reading this then. And so I came on and I read it. And actually, it was fascinating. I mean, I've since got another copy and it's on the shelf behind me. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Actually, I could spend time studying this in order to become the advertising copywriter. And so that set me on the path to studying psychology. And then I don't know whether by the time I went to uni or whether it was during the time at uni, I kind of let go of the whole advertising thing. But I knew I was really interested in psychology. I was really interested in what led to people doing the things they did. And it kind of just carried on from there. That's how I became involved in psychology. Initially, I thought I was particularly interested in how people react under conditions of stress. Look at people's reaction to things like burglar alarms and fire alarms and stuff like that. But then I got interested in this area of clinical psychology. And within that, particularly interested in how people reacted to being physically ill through some other jobs I'd done or through some family experiences. And was fortunate enough to be able to sort of shape my career around that. So that's how I got involved in it. What about yourself?
I feel like I want to ask you another question first.
Oh, yeah, please.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Like, what's the hook, though? I mean, like you said, you found it interesting, but what is interesting about it?
Psychology as a topic.
Yeah.
I think it's the promise, not always delivered, of kind of getting to look behind the scenes. I love a kind of behind the scenes at how you make movies or at the theatre thing. And I think the promise was, yeah, everybody knows that babies learn to talk. I mean, obviously they do. But what's going on behind the scenes that's not obvious to everybody? And here's some really cool, fun things you do about making babies crawl across checkerboard patterns and bits of perspex in order to test it. So there's also that little bit of how do you create something? How do you create a sort of a logically designed experiment to show something up? Yeah, so behind the scenes plus a bit of creativity and problem solving.
Like that bit in The Wizard of Oz when they lift the curtain to see
Yeah.
what's behind.
Yeah, do not look at the man behind the curtain.
Hmm. So
But
it might.
isn't that the case that perhaps it's not the case for everybody, but there is something about access to the bits that aren't quite so publicly visible that's very appealing. There's always something like, on the odd occasion in the hospitals I've worked at, when you're going through like the corridors that aren't public access corridors, and they're always really grotty and dingy and pretty dirty, just getting from one building to another. But there's something about belonging there in a place most people don't get to see that, to me, always felt kind of quite exciting.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that's very different to my story. I mean, I had no intention of becoming a psychologist. I didn't even know that such a thing existed, and I did a bunch of A levels, none of which were psychology. And I think I was in that generation of people, and you know, a socioeconomically privileged group of people where going to university was kind of expected, and you could get a grant for doing so. So it was free money. You either wanted a job or you went to university. I didn't want a job, so I went to university, and I just had to pick something that was interesting. I thought, what could I do that would be interesting? And so with absolutely no plan or no intuitions about my career whatsoever, I just picked psychology. Just I think maybe for some similar reasons, just was
Mm.
interested in what makes people tick. Why do people do the things they do? Now, fast forward many years later, my therapist, I forget why, but we were exploring my childhood, as you could expect. There I was on the couch, talking about my mother. What my therapist said was that this was a very interesting career choice. So my father is a Church of England vicar, so
Mm.
he's a man of the cloth. And she said, in many ways, you're like a kind of secular priest, in terms of what you do. You listen to people week in, week out. They sort of air their dirty laundry, and you find ways of helping them, sort of absolving them, in a very similar way to the way priests do. So she was sort of interested in this idea of all the things you could have done. You've ended up doing something very much like your dad, but in a sort of secular, more scientific way. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, it's similar, I suppose, for me in some ways to you. There's just something fascinating about it, and I kind of like the idea that I'm never really going to know. Like I'm never going to be bored. There will always be more questions than answers. And I mean, it's a whole big load of stuff wrapped up in this. But I remember somebody saying about religion, I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. And that kind of sums up why I'm not a person of faith. And I am very interested in science and finding stuff out, but also intrigued by the fact that I'm never going to know.
That's an interesting path. Does it ever bother you that you don't know? I mean, do you ever get that moment of panic opposite a client of thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing here?
Oh yeah, sometimes, yeah, and I think that comes back to what we spoke about during the last episode about feeling like a fraud, and even with age and experience, that doesn't really go away. You just sort of learn to live with it better. Yeah, so sometimes it's worrying. Sometimes you feel like you're winging it a little bit. I feel like there's an honesty that's required in those situations. So a very dear friend and colleague of mine, who you know too, Ricky Kjelgaard, she has this nice line about therapists. Kind of, we ought to position ourselves as the cheerleader rather than the guru. We shouldn't really
Mm.
be the fount of all knowledge. We should be the person who's sort of cheering along, from the sidelines as someone is actively making change in their own life.
Mm.
So I think as long as I stay true to that, it's sort of okay to not know everything all the time.
Yeah. But there's a real kind of like tension, isn't there, between the knowing and not knowing? It would be relatively easy to walk into a situation and say, I don't need to know anything. I never need to know anything, and we wouldn't necessarily be able to either help people make sense of stuff or help them move forward if we were going with absolutely nothing. And yet, it's not the nature of the kind of psychology that certainly that we're involved with to think that you're actually, you're finding the absolute truth in the same way that maybe a physicist is attempting to actually find out how the sun works. They might know they've not got it completely, or there'll be a new quantum explanation in a bit, but they're really trying to get to the heart of, yeah, it is to do with hydrogen and helium. It's not just a big golden ball in the sky drawn by a chariot. So sometimes I think in our work, we are trying to narrow possibilities and come up with coherent explanations for things in a kind of scientific manner, drawing on a scientific literature, but at the same time, kind of having to say we never really properly know
Hmm.
in a way that's perhaps different to that physicist.
If you were to come up with a pithy, media-friendly definition of psychology, I'm putting you on the spot here. I'll tell you what, I'll help you out by this was mine.
Okay.
The science of human behavior.
Basically the same. Again, depressingly similar points of view, the two of us. I've tended to say a scientific approach to understanding the relationship between brain, mind, and behavior.
It's better than mine.
Was it? Comparison is a thief of joy, but mine is
Mhm.
longer.
Good. I like that. So here we both are then. So we've, of all the various things we could have done in our lives, we've dedicated our lives to the practical application of psychology. Because I mean, I guess that's one thing to say is that
Mm,
there's lots and lots of different ways to be a psychologist. There are lots of our colleagues who, they're just sticking people's heads in scanners all day long, and they're very sort of hard-edged scientific
yeah.
side of psychology. Ours is a little more, a little less precise, I suppose, a little less predictable in terms of trying to practically apply some useful theory
Yeah.
to help people who are struggling. In your case, people struggling with in relation to physical health. In my case, more mental health. We found ourselves in this situation. Clinical psychologists. One of the things I think is just an interesting angle on this is what other people think of us. So I'm going to give you a few typical scenarios. These are things that seem like they happen quite a lot. So, are you reading my mind?
Yep, I've had that one. I've I,
I meant, are you reading my mind?
clearly not, because I just talked over you.
Yeah. So you've had that.
Yeah, I've had that. I mean, that I think is one of the commonest. If you're at a social function, somebody asks you what your job, but did you read your mind? Yeah, we agree.
Next one. Have you got a couch?
Ah, I don't think I've had that one, but I can see exactly how it would work, and I sometimes do envy a couch. I've never used one in therapy. Though I've done lots of bedside stuff, so I guess that's similar.
How do you cut off? How do you leave work at work?
Definitely had that one a lot. You must have as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, all the time. I think people. It comes on to one of the things I was going to mention in a minute, but I think people respond to the idea of someone working as a psychologist with a sort of mixture of awe and terror.
An
I've,
occasional
I've
contempt.
oh yeah, and contempt. Yeah, that's in there sometimes as well. Not often. I think most people are quite nice and kind about it, but that does happen. But I think some people are like, well, yeah, I wouldn't want to listen to other people's painful stories all day long. So how on earth do you do that? And how do you leave that behind at
Mm.
work without that having an impact on your private life? And then I've had the terror reaction of people turning on their heel and walking in the other direction. Like I'm not talking to that guy. I was in a social situation once, and somebody seemed fine with me, and then we were due to go out later somewhere, and this person made an excuse and didn't come, and I later discovered it was because they'd found out I was a psychologist. That was what I did for a job.
Really?
So
That's quite extreme,
I'd
isn't it?
become such an aversive sort of stimulus to them
Yeah.
because I worked as a psychologist.
Were they a Scientologist? Because I once felt slightly proud to be told I was part of an intergalactic conspiracy,
Ah,
uh,
by a
at being a
psychologist.
psychologist. Yeah, yeah.
Wow, I've never had that.
Which sounded much grander than my actual job.
So you're a psychologist. I bet you've got your life sorted then.
Yeah. Yes, I've had that. I have had that, and always puts you in the dilemma of how do you respond, with just hollow laughter fading into tears, or disarming grin and maintain eye contact and nod.
It's surely one of those sort of fallacies, isn't it, that everybody who works in some sort of helping profession has somehow figured out the meaning of life and has got all their ducks in a row.
Yeah.
That's not the case, is it? We can debunk that myth straight away.
Oh, pretty much straight away.
I was going to say it's much easier, isn't it, to look at other people's issues rather than your own.
It is both easier and more possible. There's all sorts of really practical reasons why that wouldn't be the case. Quite apart from the fact that, look at parallel examples, the plumber always has a tap that drips at home. Cobbler's children go unshod. So, we're part of a noble tradition, as well as being just that classic TV trope of the
Yeah.
of a psychologist or psychiatrist with a messy personal life.
TV representations of psychologists are awful, aren't they?
It's
I,
terrible.
I haven't seen. I mean, I probably have, but I can't think of any that were good. Everything that comes out of their mouth sounds just dreadful. But it doesn't make me wonder whether everything that comes out of my mouth sounds dreadful to other people. Maybe that's just how psychologists sound.
Maybe. I mean, I kind of hold on to the idea that the reason for that is actually if people were really hearing real sessions, it would be quite boring to them. What we're doing is not a spectator sport. And so when you dressing stuff up for drama, you have to create other things than what we actually are trying to do, which is absolutely not about the drama. There have been a couple of examples that have been sort of quite accurate, but again, they came across as quite bland, contained people, which doesn't make for great drama.
No, it doesn't make for good telly, does that at all? Next one. I'm gonna term this "So You're Not a Proper Doctor" then.
Oh yeah.
And it's got a flavour of, well, everyone's a psychologist, aren't they? What's so special about that? That's not really a proper job.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've all had variants of that, haven't we? And again, how we play it depends on how much we care about the other person, how much it's just a question of handling it socially without insulting them, or how much we feel affronted and actually want to defend the position. The proper doctor one is quite actually, again, because I tend to work in very medical settings, I've had many, many times. And to the extent, actually, quite often I don't use my title at all. That's mainly just to prevent confusion. If people are used to doctor being the prefix for a medical practitioner, I tend to encourage that everybody refers to me by my first name rather than as Dr. Owen, just to avoid confusion. But with colleagues, particularly medical colleagues, I'm always very ready to point out the history of the term doctor, how late in the day the medical profession decided to just award it them for not failing their exams and basic training, compared to, the history of it as requiring research and a contribution to knowledge. I then get off my soapbox and try and get on with my day.
Yeah, it's one of those things you could get a bit chippy about. I really try not to, and I'm like you. I don't particularly go overboard with using that title. Don't find it terribly helpful unless I want a better table at a restaurant.
A better email address. You can,
Yeah.
stick doctor at the front of your email address, and suddenly all the possibilities of Gmail are there for you. No more Ray Owen 3742 for me.
I don't know why I said that thing about a restaurant. I've never done that. That sounds like I'm way more up my own arse than I actually am. I have had people treat me noticeably different though when they've seen, perhaps because I don't know whether it's on my bank card or,
Yeah.
or I have to provide some ID and it's on there,
Yeah.
and that's weird. That's really
Yeah.
weird. Very uncomfortable. We should probably, just in case there are people listening to this who aren't, aware of the sort of nuances and the differences. Well, there's two things I'd like to just cover before we finish. One is that psychology is different from psychiatry. Someone who works as a psychologist is not a medically trained doctor, so a psychiatrist is a medically trained doctor, and so they are looking at the world through a medical lens. Everything is around considerations of health versus illness. Psychologists are not doing that. Mostly, psychology is not particularly concerned with diagnostic or medical issues. And so, one of the things that I find is I suppose a bit of a soapbox issue for me is the medicalization of distress in a way that isn't really supported by the science. So deciding that something is a disorder and kind of treating it as being equivalent to a physical health diagnosis without really the same sort of rigor. So I think to summarize this, I think most physical health conditions are discovered, whereas most mental health conditions are invented. And I don't say that with any disrespect to people who struggle psychologically. I've experienced a diagnosis of depression myself, so I'm not saying that it's not real or it's all in your head or anything like that. I think these experiences are very real. I'm just not convinced of the evidence that they are equivalent to medical diseases, because I don't know what the medical disease process is. You can't get a blood test
Yeah.
for depression. You couldn't do an autopsy and say, yeah, this guy died of depression. It's not the same. in that way. And so I think I find myself resisting the medicalisation of distress because it doesn't feel like it has a genuine scientific basis.
Yeah, and rarely takes us towards right what the next thing to do is, given the variability within people who might attract the same diagnosis. What's actually caused the issue, how it presents, and what works for them may be completely different between two people with the same diagnosis, but the same between people with two different diagnoses. And that's different. That is, again, working in sort of often in medical settings, that's very different between the difference between influenza and lung cancer. There's a far clearer distinction between the two of those. And the pathological mechanisms are much, much clearer between them. And, I think human minds like categories and they like thingness. I think the philosophical term reification is making something a thing makes it easier for us to grasp. And I suspect that's why it is an attractive way of looking at it.
Mm. It's easier, isn't it? It's an easier way of looking at it, and I think it lends itself more easily to lots of other domains of life. The example that comes to mind really readily is the first time I ever did any expert witness work, and so this, without breaching this person's confidentiality, it was an ill health retirement case, and it was the person involved was early 50s, I think. So there was some time to go until their kind of retirement date. They'd suffered a very difficult bereavement. I was being asked to comment on whether this person should be retired early on ill health grounds. My answer, as you can imagine, was somewhat nuanced, and I was looking at different sides of the argument. And I basically came down on the side of, at the moment, doesn't seem like this person's going to be able to work, but you never know. Things change, and who knows? But at the moment, doesn't seem like it's probably viable. That took 3 or 4 pages to say that. And then I got the psychiatrist's report, which said, this person will never work again. It was literally one sentence. And but there's a clarity to that, isn't there? There's a sort of
Yeah,
confidence and a clarity to that if you're somebody having to make that decision, that is really helpful.
that's
And
useful.
I think what we do is useful too, but it is much more nuanced. We are much more likely to find ourselves in shades of grey, looking at different arguments for and against a particular position.
Yeah, I think that reflects our way of approaching understanding the world, isn't it? That there are multiple determinants of anything and therefore multiple possible paths onwards
And no absolute truth.
and no absolute truth within it.
Yeah.
And and again, we have to, I think, just to stay sane and be able to communicate, I think we have to have categorization. And categorization can be really useful. One of the difficulties comes with how people then react to that language and to that behavior of categorization. All sorts of conversations one could have around it's like a mental health sort of diagnosis like depression, or a description of a group of people with certain attributes in common like autism. And there's a real benefit. There's a real benefit in being able to use this word to say, look, we're not talking about sort of like recipes for fruit salad here. We're talking about people who have significant problems with their mood that's really affecting their life, or we have people who have a slightly different approach to processing the world that brings them some benefits but some disadvantages. It's really useful to be able to point towards that group. The difficulty comes when we think that the name tells us exactly how everything works. And certainly one of my things, and I really wish I could remember where I first read this, and I've tried sort of Googling it and I never really found successfully where it comes from. So maybe I made it up, but I don't think I did. But it's the idea that our problem is that we take descriptions and we use them as explanations. So we say, these people all got this kind of problem. Oh, yeah, we're going to call it depression. Okay, well, why are they like that? Oh, because they've got depression. So we've applied a description on something, and then we use that as the causal explanation. And that's, I think, the thing that we can't afford in our kind of work, to get stuck at that level.
To quote Korbinski, the map isn't the territory.
Yeah, nice.
The name, the label you attach to something is not the same thing itself. And it's you mentioned autism back there, and there's another one-liner that I like, which is, well, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person.
That's really nice. That's really nice. Go back to the map is not the territory. My late father-in-law was a man with a particular approach to the world and his understanding of the world. And he would draw in on road atlases. So this is long before sat-nav, when you had physical road atlases. He would draw in motorways that were planned, and on occasions where he thought motorways should be, and then just leave that in the car. And if you weren't careful, you would end up following his idea of where the motorway should be rather than anything else. So he really was, I think, a believer that altering the map somehow altered the territory.
That reminds me of those stories of the early days of sat-navs when people would find themselves in rivers,
Oh,
sort of
yeah.
believing that what was on the sat-nav was truer somehow than what's in front of their very eyes.
The joys of rule-governed behaviour. We could do another
Mm.
session on rule-governed behaviour.
We could do that, definitely. Yeah. So I'm not sure we've solved anything here today, although we've kind of thrown around the topic of psychology in a way that I've enjoyed it.
Me too.
I don't know whether our audience member has. We'll see. So it's time. I think it's time.
I'm ready.
Okay.
Let's go and ask Ray, shall we?
Do you believe in ghosts?
No, unless it's 2 o'clock in the morning in an old house and there's a storm outside. When I still don't technically believe in ghosts, but everything in my body and my learning history is making me absolutely crap myself.
Fascinating. I mean, see, where would we be without psychology in order to try and unpack that? So a rational man who doesn't believe in ghosts in any other situation, but give him the right set of circumstances,
Yep.
and
Yeah, and all of the horror movies. When I was a kid, staying up late for the double bill on a Saturday night on BBC Two of the old creaky Frankenstein movie, and then the 70s slightly raunchy one, you might get to see some naked people if you were really lucky, sort of Hammer horror movie. And all that goes in, doesn't it? That observational learning, those associations are there. And whatever bit of my brain makes me panic, he doesn't know the difference, I don't think.
it's so funny that you mentioned those late night double bills. I mean, being a bit younger than you, obviously, I keep getting that in. I used to stay up with my dad watching
Right.
those, but I could never quite make it. I was I was too young. I needed my sleep, and I'd fall asleep. So I've got all of these sort of half remembered Frankenstein and Dracula films.
Oh, the
You know,
Universal films.
the 1930s one, yeah, Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, and I never managed to stay up late enough to watch the raunchy Hammer ones. So.
Well, there you go. Of course, this was a world even before VHS. So, your chance to go out and make up for what you'd missed didn't exist. But in this streaming world, they're all out there waiting for you.
Okay, well, I think that's probably we've done psychology there, haven't we?
Sorted.
What more is there to say? I'll see you next time.
See you then.